Ethan Calloway came to the ceremony hall for one reason only: to fix a junction panel before the Navy SEALs arrived, not to be noticed, not to be remembered, and certainly not to be mocked. He wore a gray maintenance uniform, carried a worn toolbox, and moved through the corridor the way water moves around stones, quietly, without resistance, without ego. But when his sleeve caught the edge of a mounting bracket and rode up past his wrist, a long, deep scar ran into view. A few of the SEALs laughed. One called it a kitchen accident. Then Admiral Nathaniel Hawthorne walked in, saw it, and went pale. "Everyone out," he ordered, "right now." Because that scar didn't belong to a maintenance worker. It belonged to a mission that had been erased from every official record that existed. The naval training facility on the Virginia coast ran on a particular kind of routine: early formations, equipment checks, the low hum of institutional discipline that kept everything in its place and everyone in their role. On the morning of the recognition ceremony, that routine had been polished to a high shine because the base was hosting something rare. A formal ceremony honoring a Navy SEAL team returning from a classified international assignment, attended by one of the most senior admirals in the service, filmed by credentialed journalists, and sponsored in part by Ashford Defense Systems, a private defense technology company whose CEO had flown in the night before. Nobody in that building was expecting the day to go sideways. Nobody, that is, except possibly the man in the gray maintenance uniform who arrived before the catering crew, signed in at the civilian entrance, and asked the duty sergeant which junction box needed attention before the main event. Ethan Calloway was 39 years old, broad-shouldered in a quiet way, with a face that had settled into the stillness of someone who had long ago stopped performing emotions for an audience. He'd worked civilian maintenance on that base for 4 years and had become part of the infrastructure, noted only when something needed fixing, invisible the rest of the time, which was exactly the arrangement he preferred. In the pocket of his jacket he carried 2 things he never left home without: a work phone and a folded drawing done in crayon by his 8-year-old daughter Clara, a stick figure in gray holding a wrench, with "My dad fixes things" printed at the top in careful letters that she had made when she was 6. That same morning he'd texted a thumbs up to a reminder about cough medicine and asked his shift supervisor, a tired man named Del Rey, for permission to leave no later than 5:15 for school pickup. Del Rey said sure, as long as the sound system worked. Ethan said it would. What Ethan did not say to Del Rey or to anyone else on that base was anything meaningful about himself, not where he had served, not whether he had served at all, not what the long sleeves he wore in every season were covering, not why he sometimes stopped mid-task and stood very still for a few seconds the way people do when a sound reaches something the conscious mind can't fully reach back. He answered questions about voltage tolerances and conduit specs. He did not answer questions about his past. The people without clearance assumed they already knew the answer. He was a maintenance worker. He had always been a maintenance worker, and whatever had happened to his arm was probably something domestic and forgettable. Those assumptions were a kind of shelter, and Ethan had learned to live inside them without complaint, because the alternative was a story he had made a careful decision not to tell. The junction box was in worse shape than the work order suggested: 2 corroded terminals, 1 breaker running on stubbornness alone, the kind of electrical patience that is one bad afternoon from a small fire. Ethan worked methodically, tools laid out on a folded cloth to his left, in the focused silence of someone at peace with solitude as a permanent condition. He was still at the East Corridor panel when the overhead announcement came through. Commander Bryce Langston's team had arrived and were proceeding to the pre-ceremony staging area. Ethan finished seating a connector and kept going. Captain Donovan Hale found him 7 minutes later, moving at the velocity of a man whose entire professional morning was balanced on a 90-minute event, and told him the main hall junction panel needed to be cleared before the Admiral's motorcade arrived. Less than 40 minutes now, and that the panel was directly behind the stage, which meant Ethan would be working beside the SEAL team's staging area and needed to be done and out of the way before the ceremony began. Ethan picked up the toolbox and walked toward the hall. Commander Bryce Langston was 28 years old, which was not old enough to have fully earned the confidence he carried, though nobody on his team would have said so to his face. He had finished top of his Bud SWH class, completed back-to-back international deployments, and been recommended for the recognition ceremony by a chain of command that understood optics. Young, capable, photogenic officers were good for recruitment, sponsor relationships, and the kind of public goodwill that defense budgets occasionally required. Langston knew all of this and wore it with the ease of someone who had never seriously considered the possibility that certainty might outrun wisdom. Lieutenant Cade Whitaker, walking beside him, was different in the specific way that men are different when they have learned to make everyone else the punchline. He was funny at other people's expense, and he had a habit of treating civilian base personnel with the dismissiveness of someone who had never been called to account for it. That morning, watching Ethan Calloway routing cable near the back wall of the staging area, Whitaker felt he was not being watched by anyone who mattered. He was wrong about that, and about several other things. The friction started simply. A cable Ethan was routing across the floor created a brief tripping hazard. He had marked it on both ends per standard procedure, but Whitaker stepped over the marker, stopped, and said loudly that distinguished military personnel needed to use this walkway, and maybe the building maintenance department could figure out a way not to embarrass itself on a formal occasion. Ethan looked up, said he understood, and asked for 2 more minutes. Whitaker looked at the gray uniform, the worn toolbox, the face of a man who did not appear to recognize how outranked he was, and said sure, take his time, and not to ruin the only job they'd brought him in to do. Ethan said nothing, secured the cable, and moved on. Langston had watched the exchange without intervening, which in a room structured by hierarchy meant the same thing as permission. Victoria Ashford came through the side entrance 10 minutes later, with the composed bearing of someone who understood that entering a room was its own form of communication. The CEO of Ashford Defense Systems, 41 years old, scanning the hall with the systematic attention of someone cataloging variables. She was looking at the staging setup when Ethan reached up to secure a breaker cover, and his sleeve caught on a mounting bracket and rode up past his forearm. The scar was long, pale against weathered skin, running from a point near his wrist toward the inner elbow, with the texture of something that had required surgical attention and enough time to finish healing. There was something else near the wrist, smaller, a distinct depression with a slightly geometric quality, but the sleeve came back down before most people in the room had registered more than the length of the mark. Whitaker had been watching, he said, with the comfortable delivery of someone who had run this particular kind of joke before, that the maintenance guy had a very dramatic kitchen accident on his record. 2 SEALs nearby laughed. Ethan pulled his sleeve down, secured the panel cover, and said nothing, but the cable in his hands tightened by 1 precise increment, and anyone fluent in stillness would have recognized that this man was not unaffected, only practiced. Cade Whitaker, emboldened by the laughter, pushed the joke a few steps further than the situation required. He asked Ethan if the scar was from a dishwasher repair, or maybe a ceiling fan that had gotten the better of him. A 3rd SEAL offered that it looked like something from a hardware store liability claim. Bryce Langston did not laugh, but he did not intervene either. which in a room defined by hierarchy meant the same thing as permission. Ethan finished coiling a short segment of test wire, set it carefully in his toolbox, and said, without turning around, "Some scars don't need explaining." He said it the way someone states a fact about ambient temperature, not defensive, not performative, just accurate. Whitaker's grin sharpened. He said that was exactly what someone said when the story behind the scar was embarrassing. More laughter. Ethan closed the toolbox latch, pressed it until it clicked, and went back to the panel. Victoria Ashford had heard the exchange. She was consulting quietly with her communications director about the slide order for the public announcement, and she had the focused, partially distracted quality of someone managing two conversations at once. But she had heard it. She did not react. Exactly. There was no visible shift in her posture or expression, but she noted it with the same precision she applied to everything in rooms where her company's reputation was at stake. In her working assessment, the maintenance worker was a negligible factor. The ceremony was the platform, the contract announcement was the objective, and any interpersonal friction between base personnel and her company's sponsored team was irrelevant as long as it resolved itself before the cameras were live. She made a small note to mention to her communications director that the staging area needed to be fully cleared of civilian maintenance staff before the formal arrival of the Admiral. It seemed like a reasonable operational detail. It did not seem like a decision that would matter. Captain Hale appeared at the hall entrance and said, in the clipped tone of someone who has been running on institutional anxiety since 6 in the morning, that the Admiral's motorcade was 22 minutes out, and that the staging area needed to be clear in 15. He looked at Ethan and said the panel work needed to be finished, and the civilian contractor needed to be off the stage platform before Admiral Hawthorne arrived. Ethan said he understood, and that he had one connection left to verify. Hale nodded and moved on to the next of approximately 14 things he was managing simultaneously. Ethan reached up a second time to check the top terminal on the panel. His sleeve rode up again as he extended his arm, this time higher, past the initial scar, and the light from the overhead fixture caught the small geometric depression near his wrist at a direct angle. It was not a normal surgical scar. It was not a burn or an industrial mark. It was a precise, small indentation, about the diameter of a pencil eraser, with a slightly triangular quality that suggested it had been made by an instrument designed for a specific purpose. A man standing near the back of the staging area, a retired Navy corpsman now working in base medical services, glanced up from his phone and went very still for a moment, the way medical people go still when they recognize something they were not expecting to see. He opened his mouth, hesitated, and then the overhead speaker cut in. Admiral Nathaniel Hawthorne's motorcade had arrived at the main gate. The announcement changed the quality of the air in the room in the way that announcements of significant arrivals always do. A general straightening, a subtle recalibration of energy, the involuntary performance of readiness that even people who are not in uniform produce in the presence of certain kinds of authority. Bryce Langston stood taller. Victoria Ashford put her phone away. Captain Hale appeared at the hall doors with the expression of a man greeting a weather system he had been preparing for all week. Admiral Nathaniel Hawthorne entered without pageantry. He was 63, compact, with the eroded quality of a man whose face had long since stopped carrying the weight of other people's expectations, and his posture communicated the particular authority of someone who had been decisive in situations where decisiveness had real consequences. He moved through the hall at the measured pace of a senior officer who knew that the room adjusted to him, not the reverse. He was 3 steps past the door when his eyes found Ethan Calloway. Ethan had his back turned, still at the panel, still working with the quiet efficiency that had defined his presence in the hall all morning. He was not aware, in the first second, that anything had changed. Then some part of his peripheral system, the part that had been trained years ago to register the qualities of physical space that most people missed, registered that the ambient sound of movement in the room had changed. He turned slowly. He saw the Admiral, and Admiral Hawthorne, looking directly at him across 40 feet of ceremony hall, went absolutely still in the way that people go still when they recognize something that history told them should not exist. Ethan understood what was happening in the same second Hawthorne understood it. Ethan pulled his sleeve down, reached for his toolbox, and began moving toward the side exit with the quiet urgency of someone who has practiced disappearance. Hawthorne said in a voice that did not require volume to carry, "Calloway." The room did not breathe. Cade Whitaker, who had still not recalibrated his understanding of the morning, muttered something under his breath. A short, low commentary in the register he used for jokes that weren't quite jokes. Hawthorne heard it. He turned. He asked, with a precision that was colder than any raised voice, who had been laughing at that man's scar. Nobody answered. Hawthorne looked at Whitaker for 3 seconds. Long enough for Whitaker to understand that the 3 seconds were deliberate, and then turned back to Ethan, who had stopped walking. Hawthorne crossed the hall in measured strides, stopped 2 feet away, and looked at the arm without asking Ethan to extend it. He didn't need to. He had seen that type of mark before. Once, in a medical debrief 11 years ago, in a conference room at a facility whose name did not appear on any public roster of naval installations, he had seen photographs of exactly that indentation, on exactly that part of the forearm, on the men who had participated in a single operation that the official record described only as an environmental incident in international waters. Hawthorne said quietly, "Calloway, when did you come back to base service?" Ethan said just as quietly, 4 years, sir." Hawthorne absorbed that. Then he looked at Captain Hale and said, "Shut off the cameras, clear the room, and close the exterior doors." When Hale hesitated, because the ceremony was 20 minutes away, because there were journalists in the adjacent room, because Victoria Ashford's communications team had already positioned 2 camera operators, Hawthorne repeated himself. His voice did not change in volume or tone. The instruction was the instruction. Hale moved. The camera operators began packing up. The communications team exchanged uncertain glances. Whitaker and 2 other SEALs moved toward the exit, and Hawthorne said, "Not the team." They stopped. He looked at Victoria Ashford and said she would remain as well. He looked at Captain Hale and said he would remain. He looked around the room and identified, without appearing to look at anyone, exactly who stayed and who left. When the exterior doors closed and the sound from the corridor outside faded to silence, Hawthorne turned to the remaining group and said, "Nobody in this room records anything. Nobody discusses what is said here with anyone outside this room until I authorize it." Is that understood? It was understood. The room had shifted from a ceremony staging area into something else entirely, something that felt, to everyone in it, like a space where the official version of events was about to encounter its first serious challenge. The silence lasted several seconds after the doors closed. Hawthorne was the one who broke it, and he did not break it gently. He looked at Ethan and asked a single question, "Do you remember the mission designation?" Ethan was quiet for a moment. He was looking at a fixed point somewhere between the floor and the middle distance. The way a person looks when they are deciding not how to answer a question, but whether the moment has arrived when the answer can no longer be withheld. He said, "Operation Black Lantern." The name produced a visible effect in the room. Not comprehension, because none of the people present except Hawthorne and Ethan possessed the context to understand it, But the recognition that a name capable of silencing an admiral at the mention of it was not an ordinary name. Captain Hale's expression shifted from ceremonial strain to the kind of sharp attention that military officers produce when they realize they are in the presence of something well above their clearance level. Bryce Langston stood with his arms at his sides and said nothing, which for Langston, whose baseline posture was one of ready commentary, was itself a response. Victoria Ashford was watching Hawthorne's face, with the careful lateral attention of someone reading a situation through its effects rather than its content. Hawthorne said they would speak plainly. Operation Black Lantern had been a classified maritime rescue operation conducted 11 years ago in international waters off the northern Arabian Sea, a research and support installation, floating, officially categorized as a weather monitoring platform but functioning as a combined technical and medical staging facility for a long-running regional operation, had experienced a catastrophic systems failure. Communications went dark. The automated emergency egress mechanisms failed. A weather event compounded every timeline. The official mission report, filed 48 hours after the incident, stated that a recovery team had responded, found the structure compromised beyond safe entry, and returned to base with no survivors recovered. That report was what remained in every accessible file. What the report did not include was what actually happened. Hawthorne paused. He looked at Ethan and asked if he wanted to continue or if Hawthorne should. Ethan said he could. He said it plainly, the way people describe events that happened to someone else, because that was the only distance that made the description bearable. He had been assigned to the recovery team not as a combatant but as a technical specialist. He held a background in field systems engineering, specifically in the pressure-sensitive lock and egress mechanisms used in modular maritime platforms. When the team reached the installation and found the automated egress unresponsive, the mission commander had made the assessment that the structure was unsalvageable and ordered a withdrawal. Ethan had disagreed. Through a break in the weather, he had picked up a faint, irregular signal coming from inside the lower deck sections. The signal was the kind that emergency beacons produced when their batteries were dying and their internal clocks were running erratic. It meant someone was still alive and had been trying to signal long enough to nearly exhaust their battery. He had gone back not once, 3 times. On each return, he had located 1 or 2 survivors in compartments that could be opened manually if you knew the override sequence for that specific platform generation. A sequence he had helped design during his training attachment to the systems engineering team that built the installation. The 3rd time, extracting the last survivor through a pressure-equalized access panel in near-zero visibility, his left forearm had been caught between the panel edge and the mounting bracket as the structure shifted in the water. The wound required field dressing and, later, a surgical cleanup that left the scar. The geometric mark near his wrist was from a Survivalock biometric device that had been experimentally implanted just under the skin in personnel assigned to the platform, a device that served as an encrypted access key, and a passive physiological monitor, experimental and not yet field-approved, carried only by the 7 individuals who had been part of the Black Lantern attachment team. Bryce Langston said, with the careful control of someone who was processing something large, "How many people did you bring out?" Ethan said, 6. Bryce asked why that wasn't in any record he'd ever seen. Hawthorne answered for Ethan, because the answer was Hawthorne's to give, because within 48 hours of the mission, a revised incident report had been submitted through the Defense Contractor Oversight Channel, reclassifying the incident as an unrecoverable systems failure and closing the investigation. The report had effectively buried the fact that anyone had survived. It had also buried the name of the man who had gone back for them. Langston asked why. Hawthorne said, "Because two of the system's failures that night were directly traceable to a critical design flaw in the egress hardware that had been supplied by a defense contractor. If the rescue had been formally acknowledged, the equipment failure would have required a full investigation. That investigation would have cost the contractor a significant contract renewal." Bryce stared at him. Hawthorne did not blink. Ethan, across the room, was looking at his own hands. Bryce asked which contractor. Nobody answered for 3 seconds. Then Victoria Ashford, who had been standing completely still since the name Black Lantern had entered the conversation, said, "Tell me it wasn't Ashford." Hawthorne looked at her. She closed her eyes for a single moment, then opened them and said, in a voice that had gone precise and controlled, "Tell me anyway." Victoria did not hear Hawthorne's answer the way a CEO hears a business problem. She heard it the way a person hears something that aligns too cleanly with a fragment of memory they've spent a long time not examining. 3 years ago, during a quarterly briefing in her father, Roland's private conference room, she had been present for a phone call that her father had taken in front of her without excusing himself, something he almost never did, and she had heard the words Black Lantern mentioned once, very briefly, in a tone that Roland Ashford did not use for topics he considered resolved. She had not asked about it. Roland was not a man who answered questions that hadn't been invited. She had moved on and filed the memory in the place where inconvenient half-overheard things went, which was nowhere she expected to retrieve it. She was retrieving it now. Hawthorne told her plainly, the technical report filed after the Black Lantern incident had identified the primary egress failure as originating in a pressure response mechanism produced under an Ashford Defense Systems subcontract. The report had been reviewed by the contractor's internal safety team, which had concluded that the failure was within design tolerance, which was a technically accurate conclusion if you defined tolerance broadly enough to exclude catastrophic field performance. That review had been signed off on by the contractor's chief technical advisor. The contractor's chief technical advisor at that time was a man named Silas Boone. Silas Boone currently held the title of Senior Security Advisor for Ashford Defense Systems. He was, as of 9:30 that morning, in the VIP staging area adjacent to the ceremony hall. Victoria stood very still with that information. Then she took out her phone and found a message from her father that had been sent 11 minutes ago. It said, "Leave that room. Do not ask further questions. Trust my judgment on this." She showed the phone to no one, read it twice, and put it away. Ethan was watching her from across the room, not unkindly, but with the recognition of someone who had seen this particular expression before, on other faces, at the moment when inherited loyalty runs into the cost of inherited wrongdoing. He did not press her. He had spent 11 years not pressing people, and he had found that silence was sometimes the most honest form of pressure. Bryce Langston, who had been running a private calculation since Ethan's had said the word 6, asked Hawthorne if there was any record of who the 6 survivors were. Hawthorne said the personnel files had been reclassified under the same action that buried the incident report, but that he had retained a copy of the original mission roster in a personal archive. Bryce asked if a lieutenant commander named Marcus Webb had been on that platform. Hawthorne said yes. Bryce said Webb had been his advanced training instructor for 2 years and had died of a cardiac event at age 49 6 years ago, and that Webb had never once mentioned Black Lantern to anyone on their team. Hawthorne said he wouldn't have been able to. Bryce was quiet for a long time. He looked at Ethan and said he had something he needed to say, but that he wasn't sure he had the right words yet. Ethan told him the words could wait. Hawthorne explained the mark on Ethan's wrist for the benefit of the people in the room who hadn't known what they were looking at. The implanted survival lock device, experimental, small enough to be mistaken for a routine scar if you weren't specifically trained to identify it, was a unique marker for everyone who had participated in the Black Lantern attachment team. There were 7 people in the world who carried that mark. Ethan was one of them. The others were scattered, most of them separated from military service, most of them living in the same deliberate obscurity that Ethan had chosen. They had not been told to be quiet. They had simply understood, as people who had survived something that the official record said hadn't happened, that the official record had reasons for existing, and that challenging it required resources and protection that none of them possessed. Ethan had chosen maintenance work and a daughter and a folded crayon drawing in his pocket. He had chosen to be invisible because invisible people were harder to pressure, harder to threaten, and better positioned to keep the one thing that actually mattered, their children, out of a story they hadn't signed up for. The question of who had buried the report had a simpler answer than the complexity of the situation might have suggested. Silas Boone had been, at the time of Black Lantern, a dual-role operative, officially contracted to Ashford Defense Systems as a technical evaluator, unofficially serving as a bridge between the company's interests and certain oversight functions within the defense procurement process. After the incident, he had written a technical assessment that was, in every formal sense, unassailable, accurate in its measurements, careful in its methodology, and precisely designed to direct attention away from the one variable it needed people not to examine. The assessment had traveled up a short chain of command and returned with the necessary signatures. The incident had been closed. The contract had been renewed. Ethan had been the loose end Boone hadn't expected. He had survived the third entry with injuries that required a medical record, and a medical record was a thread that, pulled at the right angle, could unravel everything. Boone had moved quickly, a supplementary report through a parallel channel, reclassifying Ethan's re-entries as insubordinate procedural violations. It was enough to prevent any commendation from being processed and to create, in any future inquiry, an institutional reason for Ethan's exclusion from the official record. A sympathetic JAG officer had told Ethan quietly that he had 2 options: challenge it and spend years in a process that would cost him everything, or accept a separation package and disappear. He had a daughter who had just turned 1. He had taken the package, bought a used truck, rented a small house near a base where the school was decent, and started the second phase of his life in the same deliberate anonymity that had once been a tactical skill. Victoria, standing in that closed hall, with her father's message still unread a second time in her jacket pocket, was beginning to understand the full shape of what she had inherited. The company had not merely benefited from a buried report in some abstract corporate sense. It had been an active participant in the burial, through Silas Boone, who was still on the payroll, and through Roland Ashford, who had renewed Boone's retainer 6 months ago with full knowledge of his history. That made the company's current exposure something more serious than a reputational problem. Hawthorne said he was raising that framing not to threaten Victoria but to explain why he had closed the room. She said she understood. She did not say whether she was more frightened or more angry, but the way she held her jaw suggested the answer was both, and that she had decided to direct them in the same direction. Captain Hale's phone had been buzzing with muted urgency for the last several minutes, and when Hawthorne gave him permission to check it, the message from the base public affairs officer said that the ceremony audience was assembling, that the media pool was asking why the hall doors were still closed, and that the start time needed to be confirmed or the event schedule would be formally pushed. Outside the closed doors, the machinery of a planned event was continuing to operate on its original timeline, unaware that the room it was scheduled to use had become something different. Hawthorne told Hale to hold for 15 more minutes and to communicate to the Public Affairs Office that there was a briefing in progress. He did not explain further, because explanations were a liability, and Hale understood that. Ethan had been the one who asked about Guardian Lock. He had heard the name in passing earlier. One of Victoria's communications team had mentioned it while setting up slides near the podium access door, a presentation that was apparently planned to follow the medal ceremony. He had noted the name without registering it as significant, the way a person with a good memory for technical language notes a term they've heard in a different context. Now, standing in a room where Black Lantern had just been spoken aloud for the first time in his hearing since his separation, the connection arrived with the clarity of an equation resolving. He asked Victoria, directly, was Guardian Lock the next-generation version of the pressure response egress system? Victoria said it was. She said it was the centerpiece of a contract announcement scheduled for that afternoon, representing a significant expansion of Ashford Defense Systems' military technology portfolio, and she said it with the careful neutrality of someone who was rapidly recalculating how many of the things she'd said confidently in the last 6 months now needed to be reconsidered. Ethan asked if he could see the technical specifications. Victoria looked at Hawthorne. Hawthorne looked at Ethan. The three of them conducted a brief, wordless exchange of assessments, and then Victoria opened her presentation tablet and handed it over. Ethan took it the way he handled every tool, carefully without flourish, and began reading. The room was quiet. Bryce Langston drifted toward Ethan's shoulder, not quite looking over it, watching the direction of his attention without understanding what he was seeing. After 4 minutes, Ethan said, "The thermal pressure compensation logic in the secondary override sequence has the same single-point failure condition as the original system. If the field environment produces simultaneous high heat and high compression conditions, which is exactly what happens in a damaged structural section under load, the lock defaults to sealed rather than fail open." He paused. In the original system, that default was supposed to be a safety feature. It becomes a trap if someone is inside. Nobody in the room spoke for several seconds. Then Bryce Langston said, with a flatness that was different from his earlier self-assurance, "They were going to sell us a fixed version of the thing that nearly killed 6 people. Ethan said, "It isn't fixed." And then, from the side corridor, a door opened and Silas Boone walked in. He came in with the practiced ease of a man who had spent 30 years in rooms where bad news was being managed, which meant he came in as though he belonged there, as though his arrival was a procedural continuation of something already in progress rather than an interruption of it. He had 2 people with him. One was a man in a suit who moved like a lawyer and had the slightly elevated vigilance of someone who was being paid to interpret everything said in the next 10 minutes, and the other was a base security contractor who was there to provide the visual impression of institutional weight. Silas Boone himself was in his early 60s, silver-haired, with the relaxed posture of a man whose most powerful weapon was the ability to make other people feel as though escalating would cost them more than accepting his version of events. He looked at the room, catalogued it in a single sweep, and said that he had been informed there was some kind of internal briefing happening that involved Ashford Defense Systems' proprietary presentation materials, and that he needed to clarify that those materials were protected under the company's standard contractor confidentiality agreement and were not available for review by unauthorized personnel. He did not say Ethan's name. He did not look at Ethan's arm. But there was a precision in the way he positioned himself, slightly between Ethan and the exit, not quite blocking it, exactly like a man who is not threatening anyone while making very clear that the option exists, that told everyone in the room that Silas Boone knew exactly who Ethan Calloway was and exactly what the presence of that tablet in his hands represented. Hawthorne said, without raising his voice, that the personnel in this room were operating under his authority and that any material relevant to a pending military safety review was within scope. Silas said respectfully that Hawthorne's authority extended to naval operational matters and that a pre-commercial product briefing fell under civilian contractor regulations that superseded military review jurisdiction in this context. He said it smoothly, the way a person recites something they've thought through in advance. The lawyer took a small step forward. The room temperature dropped in the metaphorical sense that rooms drop in temperature when a threat is present that nobody is yet formally acknowledging. Then Silas looked at Ethan and said, in a tone that was conversational and therefore more frightening than an overt threat, "A man with family responsibilities understands the value of keeping certain things where they belong." He did not say Clara's name. He didn't need to. The implication was the message. Whitaker, standing near the wall, went rigid with the controlled anger of someone who had spent the last hour recalibrating his understanding of everything in the room, and Hawthorne touched Whitaker's arm once, a fraction of a contact that communicated everything necessary. This was not that kind of confrontation. This was a document problem, and document problems had document solutions. Victoria Ashford said, "Silas." He looked at her. She said, "I am the Chief Executive Officer of Ashford Defense Systems. I am requesting full access to all Guardian Lock technical and testing data, including all internal safety review records, as part of an executive-level safety audit initiated under my authority as CEO. You can tell my father that I initiated it. You can tell him I did it after reviewing the relevant history. And you can tell him that if he had wanted to prevent this conversation, he should have had it with me 11 years ago." Silas's composure did not crack. But something in the region of his eyes changed in the way that things change in the eyes of people who have just watched a resource they relied on shift to the other side of a table. He said, "Victoria, I would strongly recommend." She said, "I didn't ask for a recommendation." Ethan, still holding the tablet, was looking at a specific submenu in the Guardian Lock diagnostic data. He had found what he was looking for. It was a 3-digit error code in the internal test logs, partially renamed from the original designation, carried forward into the new system the way programming errors are sometimes carried forward. Not from malice, but from the institutional habit of building new versions on top of old foundations without examining what the foundation contained. It was the same error code that the Black Lantern installation's egress system had produced 11 minutes before the primary failure. The code had a new label. The behavior was identical. Ethan handed the tablet to Hawthorne. Hawthorne walked back out to the ceremony hall through the main doors, with the same unhurried quality with which he had entered it 45 minutes earlier. And the difference between the two entrances was that the first time he had entered a room being arranged for a celebration, and this time he was entering a room that was still trying to be that room despite everything that had happened inside the one behind it. The audience was seated. The media pool was at the back with cameras on tripods. The SEAL team, minus Langston and Whitaker, who were still inside, was lined up near the stage. Captain Hale followed Hawthorne to the podium with the expression of a man who had been told to stop managing the event and start witnessing it. Hawthorne stood at the podium for a moment without speaking, which was its own form of communication. The room quieted completely. He said he wanted to begin by acknowledging that the ceremony for which everyone had assembled would proceed, that the recognition of Commander Langston's team was legitimate and would be honored. He said that separately, the commercial announcement that had been scheduled to accompany the ceremony, the public launch of the Guardian Lock technology system, was being suspended pending an independent safety review initiated under his authority as the senior naval officer present, and that the review would be conducted by an evaluation team to be identified within the next 72 hours. He said this in the same tone in which he might announce a schedule change at a staff meeting: level, clear, final. Roland Ashford appeared on the large presentation screen at the side of the stage, which had apparently been connected to a video feed by someone on his communications team in the moments before Hawthorne had walked out. He was in a suit, in what appeared to be a private office, and he said that he wanted to address a misunderstanding that appeared to be developing around a routine pre-commercial review, and that the suspension of the announcement would cause significant disruption to contractual relationships that had taken years to build. Hawthorne looked at the screen. He said, "Mr. Ashford, with respect, no contract is worth more than the life of a person wearing a uniform. If that principle needs to be explained, then the contract discussion needs to wait." The screen held Roland Ashford's face for 3 more seconds before someone on his end cut the feed. Victoria came out of the side corridor and stood in the open space at the edge of the stage. She did not move to the podium or claim the microphone. She stood where she was and said, loudly enough to reach the press pool, "Ashford Defense Systems supports the independent review." That was all she said. It was enough. The journalists who had been waiting impatiently for 40 minutes suddenly became very attentive. The communications team that had been hired to manage this day's narrative looked at each other with the specific dismay of people whose plan has been replaced by reality. Bryce Langston asked for permission to address the room. Hawthorne gave it. Langston stood at the podium and said that earlier that morning he had been present when a member of the base's civilian maintenance staff had been treated with a degree of disrespect that Langston was not proud of. He said he would not go into details that were classified, but that he wanted to say publicly, and for the record, that he had been wrong in his assumptions about what that person had done and who that person was. He said that he had been taught repeatedly that service took forms that decorations and titles could not always capture, and that he had allowed himself to forget that lesson in a moment when he should have known better. He looked in the direction of the far corner of the hall, where Ethan had seated himself without ceremony while Hawthorne spoke. Ethan was looking at his hands. Silas Boone was escorted to the base administrative office by 2 security personnel operating under Hawthorne's direct order for the purpose of a formal interview related to the safety review. He did not resist. He said nothing as he left the hall that could be quoted directly, though he said quite a lot with the angle of his shoulders. The hallway on the east side of the building was quiet after the ceremony hall cleared. Victoria found Ethan sitting on a bench near the emergency exit, toolbox beside him, looking out through the reinforced glass at the parking lot. She sat at the far end without asking. When she said she owed him an apology, he said she hadn't signed the report. She said that didn't mean she hadn't benefited from what it protected. He acknowledged that without arguing, which seemed to disarm her more than if he had pushed back. She offered him a formal position, independent safety consultant on the Guardian Lock redesign, with full veto authority over technical certification before any military deployment, not a spokesperson role, not a company image arrangement, an actual technical seat with actual power. She said she needed someone who would say stop when it needed to be said and could not be argued out of it. He asked if she would hold that line when her legal team pushed back. She said she was holding one right now, in front of a press pool, after calling her father's bluff, and that he could decide what that was worth. He said he'd think about it. She said that was fair. Hawthorne handed Ethan an envelope in the corridor 10 minutes later. Ethan recognized the institutional weight of it before he opened it. The letter stated that the Black Lantern file was being formally reopened for record correction review, and that the supplementary report characterizing Ethan's actions as procedurally violative was being flagged for rescission pending the investigation now underway. When Ethan finished reading, he folded it once and put it in his jacket pocket beside the crayon drawing. He said thank you. Hawthorne said the thanks ran in the other direction. Ethan shook his head. He had not gone back for repayment. He had gone back because the signal was there, and he knew how to open the door. Bryce Langston came through the corridor a few minutes later, moved by the careful restraint of someone unsure of his welcome. He apologized for what he had said, for what he had allowed. Ethan listened to all of it and then said, "Cade Whitaker is good at his job." Bryce said he was. Ethan said, "That good is worth nothing if it stops him from seeing past what someone looks like. Don't let him stay that way." "That's the apology I actually need." Bryce said he understood. Ethan believed he did. He left the base at 5:10, carrying the same toolbox he had arrived with, signed out the same way he had signed in, and drove home through the kind of evening that doesn't announce itself. Clara was on the front porch, watching for the truck. She ran down the steps and asked if he had fixed the important thing. He said he thought so. She said that was good because he was good at fixing hard things, and they went inside. After dinner, she noticed the envelope with the naval seal on the counter and asked what it was. He said it was a letter about an old job. She asked if it was good news. He said it was the kind of news that was mostly just true, and that true was pretty good. The next morning he arrived at 6:45, signed in, and went to address a failing drainage valve in the gymnasium annex. In the corridor near the main entrance, he passed 4 SEALs from Langston's team going the other way. One of them saw him coming and straightened. Then the others did. Not a formal salute. This was a corridor, and he was in civilian clothes, but a visible acknowledgement, the kind that passes between people when one of them has understood that the person in front of them has carried something that doesn't show on the outside. Ethan nodded, set his toolbox at the locker room entrance, and checked the work order. The valve was corroded. He had the right tool. He got to work. Victoria began the internal audit of Guardian Lock that same week with an independent engineering team and no prior Ashford relationships. Roland Ashford requested a delay. It was denied. Silas Boone's interview with military investigators produced documentation that had not previously appeared in any oversight record. The contract announcement remained suspended. The redesign began from the failure point outward, which was the way Ethan had said it needed to be done, not cosmetic, not fast, but structurally honest. He kept his shift schedule, kept his work orders, kept the crayon drawing folded in his pocket. The scar on his arm caught the light sometimes, in the morning when he reached for something on a high shelf. He pulled his sleeve down out of habit. The body maintains the protective gestures of a chapter that has ended long after the mind has moved on. But on the mornings when he didn't, when the light moved across the length of the mark and then moved on, he let it be what it was. Not a wound, not a credential, not a story that required an audience. Just the mark left on a man who once knew which door to open in the dark, and opened it 3 times, and came home afterward to live the kind of life that no record documents, the kind that matters anyway. The scar that a room full of decorated soldiers laughed at, on the morning of a ceremony built to honor courage, was the only thing still visible from the night. Ethan Calloway went back into the dark for the last time, pulled a stranger through a door that should not have been openable, and stayed quiet for 11 years so the people he brought home could keep the lives they went back to.